I don't know if you know what a record scratch moment is, but it's kind of a meme, a sort of silly thing that started happening in movies and TV shows on occasion. And if the internet is right, and as we know, the internet is always right, no, that's not true. But as far as I can tell, the first time they used this sort of meme, this idea of a record scratch moment, was in The Emperor's New Groove. So if you've seen that movie, you know what I'm talking about. But a record scratch moment is in a movie or a TV show where something is happening, the action is happening, and often there's a sort of narrator explaining things, and then something happens. The narrator says something really bizarre, or something weird happens, and there's a sort of record scratch. And again, like for those of you who are under like 30, a record was like a thing with music on it. You used to play on a turntable, and you know, we now call it vinyl. Anyway, a record scratch plays in the soundtrack as though like, wait, what? And then the narrator will say something like, well, you might be wondering how this happened. Let's go back to the beginning. And I had a record scratch moment this week as I was reading this passage from Romans. It's a sort of typical Paul stuff. It's a little dense, and you have to kind of very carefully understand all the connections that he's making, because Paul's always sort of drawing these connections through repetition and through the imagery that he uses. And he says that thing sort of in the middle of the passage here from this 5th chapter. He says, we boast even in our suffering, because we know that suffering produces endurance. Okay, I gotcha. Endurance produces character. Oh, all right, yeah, that makes sense. Character produces hope. Oh, I get that. And hope does not disappoint. And that's the moment. And here's what it felt like in my head. Like, right, total record scratch. Like, hope does not disappoint? I was just reading along, and I was just like, what? Hope does not disappoint? What world does Paul live in where hope does not disappoint? Because I've hoped for a lot of things and been disappointed. I hoped that Dirk Nowitzki would get a second chance for another title. But Mark Cuban traded away the best assets on the team the next year after they won the championship, and he never really got another chance. I hope that someday Jerry Jones will sell my beloved Dallas Cowboys, but there's no chance of that happening. I hope that one day I'm going to walk out into my driveway and there's going to be a really nice convertible. I'm not even picky about which brand of car. As long as it's green, that's great. And that somebody will have sent me a note and say, we just really like you. Here's a convertible. I hope for all kinds of things. And that hope has often been disappointed. So what is Paul talking about when he says hope does not disappoint? Because in my experience and in your experience, hope can bring us to a place of disappointment. And that's one thing when it's about something selfish and silly, like sports and convertibles. It's another thing when the thing that we hope for is much more significant. It's one thing when we are hoping for a great birthday present. It's a very different thing when we're hoping for a world that will be more just, and we're disappointed when it's not. It's one thing to hope for something frivolous. It's another thing to hope that we might live in a nation that really is a place with liberty and justice for all. It's one thing to hope for something about ourselves. It's a different thing to hope when it's about the work of God in our world, and it doesn't seem to happen. This last week has been a hard week, just like the week before and the week before. And there are certainly signs of hope, but there are also plenty of indications that we are in a long stretch of unrest, that there is a lot of work to do, that things aren't going to immediately change. There have been lots and lots of companies, as you know, that have put out their statements about what's happening in our nation and their response to the Black Lives Matter movement. That they're making the right statements often about their work for anti-racism in our country and indeed around the world. That's hopeful. But if we gathered the CEOs and the boards of those companies who have put together such great statements, how many people of color do you think are in that room? That's disappointing, isn't it? Over the last 8 years or so, we have celebrated in lots of ways advancements for our LGBTQ brothers and sisters. Marriage equality became the reality of this land, and there were laws put in place to protect LGBTQ persons at the workplace and with their doctors. And this week, the president's administration rolled back protections for our siblings who are transgender. So there are signs of hope, and then there are great disappointments. And not just disappointments, harmful things that have happened. So what is Paul talking about when he says that hope doesn't disappoint? Because in our experience personally, and as we look at the world, it is so clear that often hope does bring us to a place of disappointment. But when I read that passage in that sentence in its full context, it points me to the idea that maybe the kind of hope Paul is talking about is something different than the sort of flimsy, ephemeral kind of hope that we talk about so easily. Because he doesn't say, we boast in all the great things that are going to happen. He says, we boast in our sufferings. Because suffering produces endurance. Endurance produces character, and character produces hope. That's a different kind of hope that emerges out of suffering and endurance and character. It's not about some kind of wish fulfillment like, oh, I just wish everything would go back to the way it was, or go to being even better. It is a hope born of hard experience. When I talk to and listen to and read from brothers and sisters in the Black community, they talk so profoundly about the long series of disappointments and heartbreak that have been the story of this country's treatment of people of color. That there are moments of great hope and indeed some advancements and steps forward, but they always are waiting for the other shoe to drop. To hear, yes, but. I'm anticipating that in the coming days and weeks and months, there will be lots of disappointment around what is currently a groundswell of motion and movement to speak up against racism and discrimination in all forms. Because it's not hard to imagine that months from now, in September and October and November, that when the work is hard, when there aren't immediate gains happening, when things aren't magically changed, that those of us who have been stirred to action might begin to want to step aside, to let go of that work and say, well, we did what we could, particularly those of us who are white and privileged and in power. That first real disappointment and setback might be enough, or maybe it'll be the second or the fourth or the 10th time that something terrible happens and things aren't magically immediately better. But we get the privilege of saying, oh, I don't want to do that work. There are other people for whom those heartaches and setbacks, the harm that will be done, They don't get to set aside and say, well, somebody else can continue that work, because it's their lives that are most profoundly impacted. The kind of hope that Paul is talking about, that is a hallmark of the Christian faith, is a hope that is earned through suffering, through commitment, through endurance. It's not some just magical, wishful thinking about what we wish would happen. It is a hope that recognizes that the road is long, that the work is a lifetime of work, that the work is generations upon generations of work sometimes. This is the kind of hope that allowed Martin Luther King Jr. to say that the moral arc of the universe is long, but that it bends toward justice. In any one moment, at any one day, it can sure look like the moral arc of the universe has been wrenched away from the direction of justice, that evil and hate have won the day. And it'd be easy to lose hope in those moments. But the moral arc of the universe is indeed long, and it does indeed bend toward justice. The kind of hope that Paul is talking about is the hope not that things are magically immediately better, but rather that God is at work, and God is present with us in our suffering. And that our suffering, that our commitment, that our endurance is not in vain. Some of us have indeed had moments and experiences of true suffering. A loved one with a debilitating illness, to sit at the side of a family member as they move from this life to the next, being personally affected by something that is heartbreaking or debilitating. And the people that I know that have endured those kinds of experiences in life are some of the most hopeful people I know. Not because God magically makes things better, but because they understand that in the long work and movement of their lives that God is with them even in moments of suffering, that they are not alone. Paul says to the Romans that it is a hallmark of the Christian faith, that being infused with the grace and the love of God, found in Jesus Christ, produces a hope, not a lightweight, wishful thinking, but a hope that says we know that God is at work, and we will put ourselves alongside the work of God for as long as it takes. I don't know much. I mean, really not much about being anti-racist. I've read a couple of books and watched a few conversations and videos and documentaries. Like a lot of you, I'm still in the learning process. I don't know much about what it is to bring together two congregations from very different cultures and different languages, and how you begin to create a place where all of God's children gather together and bear witness to the body of Christ in a way that most churches aren't able to do. I don't know how to do that. Which might make you wonder why in the world that I would be the pastor here. So I don't have that expertise yet about how to be an anti-racist church, or how to be a multicultural, multilingual church. But I'm willing to learn. And my commitment to you, as the pastor of this congregation, is that I will not let us stop. I will not let us say, we tried and, well, what more could we do? Because the hope that we have calls us to commitment, being willing to suffer alongside brothers and sisters, to be willing to do the hard work of dismantling the systems of our own congregation and our own denomination and our own hearts. And we will learn together how to do the work that God sets before us, to make this world more just, to make this world more peaceful, to make this world more loving. I have hope, brothers and sisters. I have hope that the work that God is doing now will bear much fruit. That we will be a reconciling congregation, not just in name, but in the great work that we've done to really understand what it is to be an LGBTQ person, and that we will speak up when our siblings are being discriminated against. I have hope that we will find a way to merge two congregations from different cultures and different languages and become a new place, a new kind of congregation, where the language and your country of origin are less important, are not important, in light of the grace and love of God that brings us together. I have hope that we will be a church that is anti-racist, that we will do the hard, long work of dismantling systems of oppression and discrimination that lend themselves to a sense of white supremacy. And that we will look back on these months as the start of something vital for who we are as the people of God in this place and at this time. I have hope. And that, my friends, is God's good news this day. Thanks be to God. Amen.